Okay, hello everyone. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. If this is your first time tuning in, we're here streaming every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 p.m. PST and Wednesdays at 6 p.m. PST, so right now. Today we're doing a Shanghainese lion's head meatball, which if you've never heard of a Shanghainese lion's head meatball, they are large, I'd say like baseball-sized meatballs that you will find very, very frequently in a lot of like really traditional Shanghainese food and cuisine. You probably will see it outside of Shanghai too. I know it as a Shanghainese meatball because my dad is Shanghainese, and he was the one who introduced them to me. So I guess I also are most familiar with it from other Shanghainese restaurants that I've eaten them in. So today I'm going to be doing the lion's head meatball using panko breadcrumbs, which is definitely not the traditional approach to doing a lion's head meatball. If you're keeping track, panko breadcrumbs, it comes from Japanese food, which is definitely not part of Shanghainese food. But I think it actually makes for a more tender and a little bit more crispy meatball. So a crispy meatball on the outside and a tender meatball on the inside. And I think it works a little bit better than the more traditional approach, which would be just pure cornstarch. So if you are if you're celiac or if you're trying to make it gluten-free, though, you can totally leave out the panko breadcrumbs and then just use cornstarch instead. So just replace the half a cup of panko breadcrumb that we're going to be using, and then just use 3 or 4 tablespoons of cornstarch instead, and that will act as the binding agent for your meatball. And it would be gluten-free. So, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I don't know everything about lion's head meatballs, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful or informative, or at the very least, entertaining to watch. So what we're going to do after we finish searing and wok frying our meatballs is we're going to braise it in a wok braise for about 3 to 5 minutes. And that's going to come together in a nice dark soy sauce braise, which is going to be really, really interesting. The dark soy sauce braise you probably have, if you followed these streams before, you might recognize it from the same braise that we use in a pad CU. So, diving right in. Lastly, if you have never caught these streams before, we are always concurrently live streaming over on YouTube, which is the laptop behind me. So as with pretty much every stream that I do, there is a recipe video that goes along with what I'm cooking. That recipe video, it always lives over on the YouTube channel. So if you haven't checked out the YouTube channel, definitely hop over and check some of that stuff out. This particular lion's head meatball has a recipe video in which I usually move a little bit slower. We kind of talk our way through some of the decision making that goes behind a lot of the things that I do when I write these recipes, and why I do some of the things that I do, why I leave some things out, stuff like that. Always a little bit more interesting and a little bit easier to follow too, especially if you're trying to reproduce what I'm cooking in those recipe videos. So if you haven't yet, definitely hop over to YouTube and check out some of that stuff. If you're watching on Reddit, that would be the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen. If you're watching on YouTube, you're already there. You did it. Good job. Jen, how are you tonight? I'm doing great. Thank you. Thank you for asking. Thanks for tuning in too. In addition to those recipe videos, that's also where the concurrent live stream lives. So we are always live streaming over on YouTube at the same time. So in addition to the Reddit stream where lots of folks are watching, that's also where the YouTube stream lives. That YouTube stream, it also has a whole schedule of everything that I'm going to be cooking within the next almost 3 weeks now. So if you want to know what I'm going to be cooking in the next couple of weeks, you can definitely pop over, check some of those things out. And then if you're really committed, you can look up the things that I'm going to be cooking and pick up some ingredients and cook with me. I know lots of folks have started doing that, so super, super fun. Alright, so right off the bat, you'll notice that I am actually chopping up twice as much garlic as we normally do. So normally I chop up about 4 cloves of garlic. Right now, I'm chopping up 8 cloves of garlic, which is a crazy amount of garlic, but we actually do need it. And the reason that we are doing that is because half of this garlic, it's going to go into our meatballs, and the other half is going to go into our braised. So we're going to put it in 2 separate places, which means that we need twice as much garlic. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to divide this in half, and I'm going to set half of it aside, and this is going to go into our braised. So we're going to treat this like we normally do with our mise en place, and we're going to set this aside for our braised. And then for the second half, I'm going to just go ahead, and we actually don't need to set this aside anywhere because it's just going to go straight into our meatballs. So I'm just going to put this right into the pot where we're going to be doing our meatballs, and we're going to be putting a number of things into this pot. So let's pay attention. Next up is our ginger. We're also going to be doubling this as well. If you have caught one of these streams before, you'll know that I start with these 2 ingredients very, very frequently. I would say like 90 to 95% of everything that I cook, or at least everything that I have written a recipe for, it starts with these 2 ingredients. And that's because garlic and ginger, they tend to work extremely well as the fundamental building blocks of umami. So when we're dealing with flavors like umami, which is like, if we put it colloquially, it's sort of like what savory is. I guess it's kind of like savory, but also like a little bit salty, essentially savory. Those 2 ingredients, they work really, really well as the first building blocks for umami. So very, very frequently, you will see me chopping up garlic and ginger at the start of every stream. And that's because it goes in pretty much all Chinese food, because all Chinese food starts out with umami. So just like our garlic, I'm going to be doubling our ginger today because half of it is going to go into our wok fry, and the other half is going to go straight into our meatballs. So we're doubling our ginger today, and I'm going to give it a quick mince. So lots of people have asked me, like, what is the secret behind doing a fine mince? I don't personally think that there's a real good secret behind doing a fine mince. I think it just has to do with persistence and making sure that your knife is extremely sharp. I think that's really important. And the rest of it, I think maybe have a really loose grip on your knife. So if your knife, my left hand today, or my dominant hand, is really, really loose, and then we got our fine mince. But I think the real secret is that you just have to have a lot of persistence about it. So, as with our garlic, I'm going to set half of this into our bowl, and the other half is going to go into our mise en place. We're going to set that aside for our wok fry. Tease up this ginger too. All right. Moving on. Next up, I'm going to chop up some water chestnuts, not watercress. Water chestnuts, they look very interesting because they don't really look like anything. They kind of just look like white dimes. They also don't particularly taste like anything. Really what we're looking for when we chop these water chestnuts up is that we're looking to derive a little bit of texture from it. So if you've never had a water chestnut before, they are very, very crunchy and high in like liquid content, which makes it add a nice bit of crunch to your meatball if you add them in. They are absolutely optional. You don't have to include them in your Shanghainese lion's head meatballs. I have definitely left them out before when I couldn't find them in times, but they do add a nice little bit of texture to it, which I think is like one of the quintessential elements of a lion's head meatball. So if you can get your hands on some, I highly recommend it. They don't taste like anything, so it's not going to change the way that the lion's head meatball tastes. But that nice texture and that nice little bit of crunch, it's going to add a nice effect to the meatball. So I find it's very, very useful. If you can't find water chestnuts, I know that they can be a little bit tough to find. You can also substitute these with bamboo shoots, will work just as well too, although I think that bamboo shoots might be just as hard to find as water chestnuts. And the third thing that I have heard some folks substituting it with is jicama, which also doesn't taste like much of anything. It comes from, I believe, Spanish cuisine. But it also doesn't taste like much, but it has a very similar texture though, so we get that nice little bit of crunch from the jicama. Yeah. Alright, and just like everything else with our meatballs, everything else that is going into our meatballs, I don't need to set it aside anywhere. I'm just going to drop this straight into our bowl. You will also notice that my mince is not super consistent, and I did that on purpose. Hopefully I did that on purpose. The reason that we want a little bit of inconsistency in our fine mince here is because what we're looking for is a little bit of sporadic and like larger and smaller bits of chew. So what will happen is, because that mince ended up a little bit irregular, is that we're going to have irregular bits of chew. So we'll have like this nice bit of like surprising bits of crunch and like sporadically spread out throughout the meatball, which is going to be really fun. All right. Moving on, we're going to continue to build out our meatball here. This is single egg. We don't want to add eggshells in there. And the egg, you'll find is like this is going to be consistently true for pretty much all meatballs. It's actually not specific to just Chinese meatballs. This is true with Italian meatballs, Swedish meatballs, pretty any kind of meatball that you find. There's usually, in my experience, two different elements to it. One is the egg, and the other is the binding ingredient. Today we're using panko. Very often I have seen the use of cornstarch. Sometimes I see the use of flour. Whatever it is, whatever dry element that you see going in, that's the element that causes the meatball to stick together. The other element that we often see is the egg, which is what we just added, and that adds the nice little bit of texture and kind of fluffiness to it. So those two elements, those will be consistently found across the board in most of the meatballs that you find. All right, so next up we're going to start adding stuff to our mixing bowl. Actually, let's do our bok choy first. All right, so if you're paying attention, I just changed my mind. The reason that I changed my mind is because I like to make sure that we address everything that doesn't involve raw meat before we start doing the raw meat, and that's because you don't want to try, or you want to try and avoid cross-contamination as much as you can. I'm not a huge stickler about that, but if you absolutely if you don't have to work with your raw meats before working with your veggies, don't do it, because it's unnecessary. So what we're doing today, this is baby bok choy. So if you've never seen baby bok choy, I'm super excited because this is really, really fresh baby bok choy. It looks like bok choy, but it's a little bit smaller, so it's very, very tiny bok choy. I've started preferring baby bok choy pretty much any time that I can. Or if I have to choose between bok choy and baby bok choy, and that's because baby bok choy, it's a little bit more tender. So you don't, if you've ever had bok choy and it's sort of like hard to chew on, it's a little bit chewy, not quite as crunchy or not quite as leafy or tender as you would expect. That's because it's full-grown bok choy, so also very edible. But I have tended towards baby bok choy because it's a little bit more tender. And it works really, really well in a braise. So I use baby bok choy in a number of different things. If you can't, I feel like most folks can get their hands on bok choy lately. But if you can't get your hands on baby bok choy or bok choy at all, this braise will come together in pretty much with pretty much any kind of veggie that you want. So I think the original version of this Shanghainese lion's head meatball that I based my version off of, it comes from a restaurant in San Francisco called Dragon House. That version, it actually uses spinach, which I don't like. I guess I just didn't like spinach when I was a kid. But you could pretty much use any kind of veggie that you want. So you could probably throw some mushrooms in it, use some carrots, bell pepper, whatever kind of veggie that you have. That's generally like the ethos of stir fry or wok stir frying. Is use what you have. So I love using baby bok choy, but if you don't have baby bok choy, use what you've got. And that's our bok choy. So what I just did is, baby bok choy, it's very, very small. So what I just did is all I did was chop it in half. We don't need to go much smaller than that because it is already pretty small. And that's about it. I chopped it in half and gave it a rinse. And that's all we're gonna do. All right. Come walk with Wu. Yeah, totally. Alright, so moving right along, I'm going to start assembling my braising sauce. So this is going to be the sauce that we add to our wok once everything is cooked. So this is going to be the sauce that everything slow braises in for about 5 minutes. So in my opinion, the primary ingredients to this sauce are going to be the use of dark soy sauce, which looks very, very dark, and oyster sauce. So dark soy sauce and oyster sauce, they're often very frequently mistaken for hoisin sauce and regular soy sauce, which they are absolutely not. They're super, super different from those two ingredients, although they do look the same. So this right here is regular soy sauce. And the main difference between dark soy sauce and regular soy sauce is that dark soy sauce is a lot more concentrated. So we definitely don't want to be using dark soy sauce in the same way that we're using regular soy sauce. So you'll notice that I was just pretty heavy-handed with the soy sauce here. That was 4 tablespoons of soy sauce, especially because what I'm using is actually low sodium soy sauce, which means it's a little bit less concentrated. Dark soy sauce, on the other hand, it is very, very concentrated, so we want to be very cautious with how much of it we use because it will overpower your recipe very, very quickly. All right, so that was 1 tablespoon of sesame oil, followed by, this is going to be 2 tablespoons of Shaoxing wine. So if you've never used Shaoxing wine before, it is basically Chinese cooking wine. I guess that is what it's frequently referred to as. If you can't find Shaoxing wine is essentially just dry cooking sherry. So if you can get your hands on dry cooking sherry, I feel like that's a little bit more readily available. They're basically the same thing. So what we're really deriving from it is a little bit of sweetness at the end of the day. So a little bit of sweetness and a little bit of brightness from the alcohol. All right, so next up we're going to get to our 2 main ingredients. So this is our dark soy sauce. This is going to be, I crossed it out, 2 tablespoons of dark soy sauce. So I think you might be able to see it in the camera. But you'll notice that the consistency of this soy sauce, it's a lot thicker than the regular like low sodium or red cap soy sauce that you're more familiar with. Which means that it's going to be a lot more concentrated, so it has a little bit more molasses and like sugary sweetness to it, and it is also a lot saltier. So use that stuff in really, really sparingly. I just used 2 tablespoons of it, and I think in my notebook I crossed it out and wrote 1 tablespoon. So that might have actually been too much, so we'll find out. Next up, this is 1 tablespoon of oyster sauce. Oyster sauce, it looks a lot like hoisin sauce, but it is not hoisin sauce. Hoisin sauce is very, very sweet and sugary. I found, like, to me, in my mind, hoisin sauce is kind of like the ketchup of Chinese food. And I actually use it a lot like ketchup sometimes, so I use it in mushu pork a lot. Basically as ketchup as like a topping. Oyster sauce is not at all like it. It is a little bit sweet, but it's mostly similar in its color and consistency. So we're not going to get nearly as much sugar out of our oyster sauce in the way that we would with our hoisin sauce. And to that end, we're going to be adding a little bit of sugar with some sweet chili sauce today. So if you've never used sweet chili sauce is the sauce that you will find on the Lazy Susan next to the soy sauce when you eat dinner at like Chinese restaurants. So I guess you could think of it as like sweet and sour sauce, sort of. It does not come from Shanghainese cuisine, I don't think. I believe it comes from Vietnamese cuisine. And if you're keeping track, that's one ingredient that definitely does not belong in a traditional lion's head meatball. but I actually think it works really, really well. It just gives it a nice little bit of sweetness and kind of helps everything pop. All right, next up, what I'm adding here, this is 3 tablespoons of it's like chili oil, Langan Mai, which is the one with the old lady on it, so super, super important. It gives us a nice little bit of pop and spiciness that's going to come from this. If you're not sure of which one to buy, I know that lots of folks go to Chinese grocery stores and they're like paralyzed by choice because there's so many different brands. You want, when you're buying that spicy chili oil, look for the one with the old lady on it. It's the one to get. Same with the oyster sauce, actually. I guess I could point this out too. If you're looking for oyster sauce and you're not sure which one to get the one with the little kid on it that's got the pink label on it. I think it's called the the thing that makes it stand out is the premium oyster sauce, and it has more oyster in it. So it might cost like an extra like 50 cents or something, but it has it's a little bit more flavorful and it has more oyster and fermentation going on. So if you're not sure, when you go to Asian grocery stores, usually you'll go to the oyster sauce section and you'll see like 5 or 6 different versions of the same thing. And lots of people will be paralyzed by the fact that they don't know which one to get. Get the one with the little kid on it. All right. All right, so the last thing that I'm adding to my braising sauce is going to be half of the cup of beef stock. Actually, I think this is chicken stock today. Usually I have a homemade beef stock. I ran out of homemade stock today. So we're using store-bought chicken stock today. And that is going to make up the majority of our braising sauce. So we're going to mix this up, and this is going to be the sauce that we add to our wok towards the very, very end of our cook time. So after we're done searing our meatballs and flash cooking our bok choy, we're going to add that braising sauce in, and then it's going to slow cook with all of our crispy bits, and it's going to have this nice nice saltiness and like very, very umami forward braising liquid because of all of the soy sauce and fermentation that we just added to our braising liquids. Yeah, Dutch homie. Hello, you've been watching streams for a while, you've learned a tip or two and become very impressed. Oh yeah, totally, cool. Yeah, I guess I learned a lot about knife or chopping just by like trial and error. I used to chop a lot slower. There's only like a couple of fundamental techniques that I think are really, really important in knife, in like using a kitchen knife. And I think those mainly have to do, it actually doesn't have to do with speed. I think it more has to do with safety. And that like will actually, when you learn how to chop safely, properly with safety, it will actually result in learning how to chop faster too. So the main like #1 technique that we want to pay attention to is that your fingers, it should never be out like this. Because this results in chopping your finger off. So this is probably causing anxiety to lots of people watching right now. So we never want our fingers to be out like this because you're going to end up chopping your fingers. So anytime that you see people chopping, the non-dominant hand, so in my case I'm left-handed, so my right hand is lined up with my fingers curled in. So my knife is bumping up against my knuckles, and then we're chopping downward like this. So that's very, very important because there will never be an opportunity for the knife to chop my finger off because my fingers are curled in. The worst case that will happen is sometimes the knife will come up too high and you'll come down on your knuckles. So sometimes, lots of times, probably this is true for like anyone who you've seen cooking a lot, is their guide knuckle will have a lot of scars on it. So you'll see, you can kind of see it. My guide knuckle has, I think I've chopped little bits of skin off of my guide knuckle at least 5 or 6 times. And that's okay. It's not like it's painful, but you're not going to lose a finger. You just need a band-aid. So that happens, but don't freak out. And I think like that's the key behind like how to learn how to chop quickly, is just learning how to chop safely, and then the speed will come over time. All right. So next up, I'm adding, this is 2 tablespoons of cornstarch that I'm dissolving into water. This in lots and lots of Chinese recipes, you will see this come up, and what we refer to this is a cornstarch slurry. And this is where all of the thickness from our sauce is going to come from. So up until the point where we add this slurry, our braising sauce is going to be very loose and liquidy, and that comes from all of the liquid that we involved. So if you pay attention to our braising sauce, you'll notice that it is pretty loose and kind of like basically the consistency of soy sauce. And then once we add this starch to it, as soon as we add this starch to it, it's going to start tightening up quite a bit. So in my mind, I think of it a lot as the same way that we approach pasta water in Italian cooking. So in Italian cooking with things like bologneses and carbonara, stuff like that, we cook the pasta and then we remove the pasta but reserve some pasta water. So what's happening in that pasta water is that after you cook the pasta in it, it sheds a whole bunch of starch. So the pasta water is filled with starch. So lots of times we'll see Italian chefs refer to pasta water as liquid gold because it's what you use to make a thick sauce. Without that pasta water, you can't thicken up a carbonara. So your carbonara will go basically just be scrambled eggs without that pasta water. So it's super, super important in Italian cooking to make sure that you reserve that extra pasta water so that you can thicken up your sauces. So in Chinese cooking, we do a very, very similar thing, but instead of using pasta water, you use cornstarch. That's where the thickness will come from. All right. Moving along, we're going back to our meatballs now that we've done everything that we're going to be chopping. Are we done? Yeah, we're done. All right, so up until this point, everything that we've done so far, other than the things that we added to this bowl, are for our braised. So now we're going to move on to our meatballs. So this is garlic, ginger, a single egg, and some water chestnuts. And next, the rest of everything else that we're adding here goes straight into our meatballs. So this is going to be what we use to form our meatballs. All right, so today I'm using, this is a whole pound of ground pork. I have tested this recipe out with a whole bunch of different kinds of ground mince and have ended up deciding that the real true, maybe the only thing that you want to use, maybe not, but the real best thing that you want to use is this ground pork. Because what we need in these meatballs is a lot of extra fat. So that extra fat is going to do a lot of work for our meatballs. So I have tried this recipe out with beef and turkey. And I definitely found that the ground beef, so I used some very, very lean ground beef. I think I was using like 93.7, something like that. It had a very low fat content and it ended up just burning. So without that extra fat, the meatballs will end up just burning, which is not attractive. I think the ground turkey actually would be my next best bet because it has a little bit more fat than lean ground beef. Or maybe a really, really fatty ground beef might also work. But definitely the most traditional thing that you will find in a lion's head meatball is ground pork. But either way, if you do need to substitute out the pork, I would just say substitute it with something that has a lot of fat in it. So ground beef will work, but make sure it's 80-20 ground chuck, or even ground beef or ground turkey will work too, because ground turkey has lots and lots of fat. All right, moving right along, we're going to start adding a couple of sauce ingredients to help spice things up. This is going to be 4 tablespoons of soy sauce to start, followed by 2 tablespoons of sesame oil, next up is half a teaspoon each, or I would think of it as a pinch, of white pepper, followed by the same amount of Chinese 5-spice. So lots of people ask me why I never use MSG in my Chinese cooking. And that's I assume people ask that is because MSG is in all Chinese food, so you kind of do need the MSG in order to make it taste like Chinese food. And very, very frequently you will notice that I don't add any MSG to my food. And that's because a lot of the ingredients that you use in Chinese cooking have MSG in it already. So very specifically, the reason that I bring that up is because white pepper and Chinese 5-spice contain a lot of MSG in it already. So you actually don't need to add extra MSG to some of these things because those 2 ingredients, they already have quite a bit of MSG. And I would bet, I actually haven't looked at all of the rest of the ingredients on everything that I use, but most of the sauces that we use already have MSG. So definitely soy sauce has MSG. MSG added already. Probably that oyster sauce, definitely the dark soy sauce. Things like hoisin sauce for sure. All of those things that are like very umami heavy, there's probably some quantity of MSG in it already. Which means that if you're using enough of those sauces, you don't really need to use MSG. So MSG, if you're not familiar, it looks a lot like... no. I don't have any in here, but it's essentially a white powder. It kind of looks like powdered sugar. And it's very, very fine. And it's like something that you can pinch and kind of use it like salt. So you add a pinch of it to a lot of Chinese cuisine, and it will add a little bit of extra umami to it. But I found that if you're using enough sauces like we are today, you really don't need that MSG because everything that you're adding already contains a whole bunch of MSG. So if you add extra MSG on top of those things, it will probably be over-seasoned. Can you use ground chicken? Yeah, that would totally work. Yeah, and then you could add some kind of fat substitute. I wouldn't know what to add. My best bet is if you're using something lean and you need to add additional fat, I would say bacon fat would work really, really well. Bacon fat would definitely work really well, but obviously if you're trying to avoid pork, have to think about what kind of like independent fat you could add. I don't think that a oil would work. Maybe butter might work, but I think you need some kind of animal fat in order to make it work. Casper's oil. Nice. All right, so I just realized that I forgot to add this. So the last thing that we're adding here is going to be half a cup of panko breadcrumb. Here's my half cup. All right, so one more time. Once again, if you are keeping track, this is the thing that definitely does not belong in a traditional Shanghainese lion's head meatball because obviously panko breadcrumb, it doesn't come from Chinese cooking. It comes from Japanese cooking. But I think the more traditional thing that you will find in a Shanghainese lion's head meatball, at least according to my dad, is that you would most traditionally find cornstarch in place of your panko breadcrumb. And I've experimented with both. My dad is definitely strongly in the cornstarch camp and says that the only real way of making a lion's head meatball must be with cornstarch. But I actually disagree. I think that the panko gives us a really, really nice crispy exterior with a really, really tender interior of your meatball, more so than the cornstarch does. Really, all that cornstarch is going to do is just prevent the exterior from overcooking while the interior cooks. Other than that, it won't really provide much crispiness. And so in my experience, when I've experimented with cornstarch, I don't think that you get quite as a crispy meatball without the use of panko. So I like to use panko when I make these meatballs. But if you are trying to keep it gluten-free, you can absolutely leave out the panko and use cornstarch instead. I would say use 3 tablespoons of cornstarch in lieu of the half cup of panko that we just used. So I'm mixing this all together, double checking, make sure we didn't forget anything. Yeah, and that ought to do it. And our rice is done. So that's our meatballs. We're going to start assembling some meatballs here. All right, so right off the bat, maybe I'll use gloves today. I don't really want to get pork on my hands. Right off the bat, though, you'll notice that the meatballs that we're about to roll are going to be a lot larger than your standard traditional meatball, maybe like the size of like a spaghetti and meatballs sort of situation. So most traditionally, like with Swedish meatballs, for example, you get like kind of golf ball sized meatballs. What we're going for today, though, is going to be more of a tennis ball sized meatball, and I actually learned my lesson earlier. What we want to do is actually weigh these out. So we're using 16 ounces of meat here. So we're looking for about a little over 2 ounces for each of these meatballs. The reason that I want to be very specific with how much of meat are in each of these meatballs is if you're not careful, because we're making 8 of them right now, you're going to end up with a weirdly shaped 7th or 8th meatball, which is never fun. Cool. So what I'm doing, you'll notice, if you're paying attention, we're going for something like about the size of a tennis ball. We're going definitely smaller than a baseball, but larger than a golf ball. I would say relatively around the size of a tennis ball. So we want these to be pretty large, larger than most traditional meatballs that you've come across that are usually like bite-sized. We don't want bite sizes. We want very, very large lion's head meatballs, and that's why they have the name lion's head. It comes from how large the meatballs are. So we're weighing these out. These are going to be about 2.5 ounces a piece, and hopefully if we weigh them out correctly, each of them will be right on the money, so we won't have any weirdly shaped meatballs. If you don't do it correctly, I have a feeling that we're going to mess up. You will have the last meatball or two will be a weird shape, so you'll have one oddly small meatball, which is annoying. So I have my ounce scale underneath my tray right here, and after each meatball I'm just hitting tare, so I'm clearing the scale, and then I'm just weighing out and making sure that each meatball is approximately 2.5 to 3 ounces a piece. Yeah, I think we're off. Yeah, I think this is slightly off. Alright, hello to everyone just joining. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. If this is your first time tuning into one of these streams, we're here every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 p.m. PST, and Wednesdays at 6 p.m. PST. Today we're doing a Shanghainese dish called lion's head meatball, or Shizitou. If you've never heard of Shizitou, it's basically a very, very large-sized meatball, and you'll notice, by the way, that we have 7 uneven meatballs, which is really annoying. Lion's head meatball is a dish that you will find across a lot of different cuisines, but I know it from Shanghainese food, which uses essentially ground pork packed into very, very large meatballs. So we're going for about 8, hopefully 8 2.5 ounce meatballs a piece here. So you'll notice that we only have 7, which is frustrating. That'll be fine. If you have any questions for me, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I don't know everything about lion's head meatballs, but I know lots of stuff, so hopefully I can be helpful or informative. At the very least, fun to watch. If you want to try and reproduce what I'm cooking today, too, as with pretty much everything that I cook on stream, there is also a recipe video that goes along with these meatballs, so you can bop over to the YouTube channel and you'll find that recipe somewhere on the YouTube channel. I believe it is on the front page right now. In those recipe videos, I usually move a little bit slower and take a little bit more time to talk through some of the decision making that goes behind the things that I do in some of these recipes, and like why I add certain things, why I leave some things out. Stuff like that are a lot of the things that we take a little bit more time to talk about in those recipe videos. There are a couple of different series that are going on right now. This particular dish is part of a larger series that I've been doing that's basically essentially just dedicated to reproducing foods from restaurants in the San Francisco Bay Area. So if you happen to live in the San Francisco Bay Area, this particular lion's head meatball is based off of a lion's head meatball that you can find over at a restaurant in San Francisco called Dragon House. Dragon House is no longer there anymore, as I discovered recently, but I used to eat there a lot when I was a kid. And it's, I think, on like 17 and Gary in San Francisco, and it's one of those like really, really authentic. You could my mom used to call it a hole in the wall Chinese restaurant because it's like no frills. It's really just about the food, and it's run by these 2 old ladies. And I used to go there a lot when I was a kid, maybe 2 or 3 times a month, because my parents knew the owners. So there's a whole series that's dedicated to that, and that's where these lion's head meatballs are inspired from. There's another series that's entirely dedicated to just reproducing foods from Chinese American cuisines. That's my personal favorite one because it's really fun to take apart some of those cuisines, and it's also been really, really popular. People are really stoked about that stuff. Essentially, what we've been doing is reproducing a lot of food from restaurants like P.F. Chang's and Panda Express, things like that. And kind of like picking those really, really essential or iconic Chinese American dishes, so things like General Tso's chicken, honey sesame chicken, things like that, and kind of deconstructing it and taking a look at like what makes those dishes so American. So in my experience, that can be really, really interesting because a lot of those dishes are not American or not Chinese at all. They're basically just American food because they're basically just fried chicken a lot of the time. So it's really interesting to identify what those American qualities are and then try and remove them. And then what I usually do in those recipes is I'll do a second version where I'll reproduce those dishes without the American qualities and replace them with some things from traditional Chinese cooking. So it's really, really fun because then we end up with this weird amalgamation of like basically American food with a lot of really, really traditional Chinese flavors. So we did a version of a General Tso's chicken that had spicy black bean paste in it, which was really, really interesting. There was another version of we did a Beijing beef, which essentially is like deep fried beef, which is really, really good. And I removed a whole bunch of sugar and then reconstructed it just using sweet chili sauce instead, which is really, really interesting and super flavorful. So if you're interested in stuff like that, definitely hop over to the YouTube channel and check some of that out. There's a whole bunch of food coming up over there. Those new recipes are out every Friday, so there will be a new recipe for a hot and sour soup coming up this Friday. And then in addition to those recipe videos, that's also where the concurrent live stream lives. So if you're watching, there's a computer behind me. That's the YouTube stream. On those YouTube streams, there's an entire schedule of everything that I'm going to be cooking over the next couple of weeks. So if you were watching on YouTube, you would have known a couple of weeks ago that I would be cooking this particular meatball dish. So if you're interested in stuff like that, definitely hop over to YouTube, check some of that stuff out. Lots of fun content popping up over on YouTube. Right now what we're doing is we're preheating our wok, so you'll notice I panned over to the stove so you can take a look at my wok. There's a whole bunch of smoke coming off, and I also just went over and opened all of the doors and turned on the fan outside. That's to make sure that the smoke doesn't start billowing up. What we're looking for is all of that smoke. That smoke is very important. If you don't see that smoke happening on your dry wok, it means that you don't have enough heat. So you want to preheat your wok until you start seeing that smoke start billowing out. Otherwise, you're going to be under heat. And then once you start seeing that smoke, we can start adding our oil. So this is peanut oil going in. That's about 4 tablespoons or so. And then in Chinese cooking, this is a process we call a long yao, which is essentially adding cold oil to a preheated wok and then coating the wok in that oil. And this creates a nice non-stick surface across the wok surface. If you do it backwards, so if you add oil to the wok and then preheat the wok, you're going to end up with a really, really sticky surface. So if you've ever cooked in a wok and put stuff in it and for whatever reason everything just sort of sticks to the wok, that's because you probably did the long yao wrong. So super, super important. Preheat and then add oil. All right, so we're going to start with our meatballs first. So we're going to sear our meatballs. So we want to add these in small portions at a time. We don't want to add all 8 of these because the wok, you don't want to overload your wok here. So we're being very careful. If we overload our wok, what we'll end up with is low temperatures in the wok, which is never a good thing. So we're being very careful not to add too many things to the wok. Otherwise, the temperature of the wok is going to start dropping, and then we're going to have a mushy meatball, which is not good. So I'm adding, this is 4 at a time, and that's just enough. You'll notice that a wok is really large, so hypothetically you could fit all 8 of them in there, but we don't want to do that because it would overload the wok. Oh, finished meatballs. Yeah, I would definitely take a shot at that. I've been tweaking a Swedish meatball recipe for a long time and have discovered that it's really hard. Cream sauces are really, really hard. I don't know why I can't seem to figure out cream sauces, but for whatever reason when I make Swedish meatballs, that cream sausage just seems to break every time. All right, so in our wok, our meatballs are in our wok currently, and I'm very specifically not going to agitate the wok, and this is a really, really important element to searing, is that we don't want to move the wok around right now because we need it to sit and stay there for a couple of minutes. So I usually like to go for 3 full minutes. And what that's going to do is give us a nice crisp edge to the part that's making contact with the wok. And that's how we get that nice seared portion of the meatball. If you move the wok too early, you're going to end up with under-seared meatballs, so you won't have that crispy edge. So we're right at 3 minutes. Take a peek. A little bit longer. Simple step. Yeah, you're switching to YouTube. Definitely hop over to YouTube if you haven't checked that out yet. Over on YouTube, that's also where the concurrent live stream lives. So lots of fun stuff going on over there. I know a couple folks are already watching over there. So yeah, definitely switch to YouTube. I've heard that it's also better for watching on desktop too, so if you're watching on a laptop. Alright, so let's check these out. I'm going to start flipping here. Yeah. And you'll notice that we have these nice darkened and crispy edges to our meatballs, and that's what we're looking for, is that nice, really, really crispy edge. In food science, we call that a Maillard reaction, which is where all of the fats start carbonizing. We get a really, really crispy seared edge. So we do a similar thing in pan-seared steaks. Anytime that you're searing, really, you do the same thing with hamburgers too. All the same concept. We're looking for that Maillard reaction by creating that really nice crisp edge to your meatball. And that's going to be really important. That is always really important anytime that you're braising, because in that braise, it's also going to sit in that braise for a while, which means that we need a really nice, crispy, thick exterior to withstand that braise. Otherwise, it will start falling apart. So I've found that this is particularly true with fried chicken. So anytime I do things like honey sesame chicken, tomorrow we're actually doing General Tso's chicken on the stream. All of those things, it's really, really important to have a really, really crisp exterior to the thing that you're braising. Otherwise, it's going to start falling apart in the braise. Arhada, yeah, how's it going? Hi. Thanks for hopping over to YouTube. Welcome. All right, so we're going to let these go. Probably not for another full 3 minutes. But just long enough until we start seeing some crisping and browning going on the exterior. You will notice that anytime that you flip a meatball, and this is going to be true for pretty much any ground meat that you work with, so the same is true with hamburgers, it's actually true for pancakes too, is that the second side, it never quite sears quite as much as the first side. So don't be discouraged, that's just how pans work. But we're going to do our best to try and get that same level of sear. It's never going to be quite as much. But it will be okay. And I'm rotating the meatballs, so we're rotating just to make sure that each side of the meatball gets really, really nice and seared. I usually like to eyeball these meatballs, but if you're unsure, we're looking for 160 degrees on the internal temperature, 160 Fahrenheit. And that's the cooked internal temperature of ground pork, I think. I think there's differing opinions about that too, though. I also think that you could go a little bit under and be okay, and you're going to have a more tender meatball. What kind of wok is it? Yeah, good question. So this particular wok I got at a restaurant supply store here in Oakland, Chinatown, from a spot called Chenko. If you live in Oakland, definitely find Chenko. It's on, I think, 7 in Broadway, something like that. But if you don't live in Oakland, pretty much any Chinatown neighborhood, or really like any Asian neighborhood, will have a very, very similar store, and that's because all of the restaurants in that neighborhood are supplied by a restaurant supply company or store that provides like things like cookware and kitchenware. So usually all of the like the teapots, the plates, silverware, and the woks. So if you find yourself in a Chinatown, you will eventually find a restaurant supply store. That's where I got mine. There is nothing particularly special about this wok, other than the fact that I've cooked on it for a really, really long time. So I've been cooking probably 4 or 5 meals a week on this wok every week for the last like a little over a year and a half, almost 2 years now. I think the more important part about finding a wok is the metal composition of your wok. So my wok, this is a carbon steel wok. I love carbon steel woks because they get really, really hot, and they also develop a nice seasoning over time. So I have moved away from using stainless steel because they don't season quite as well, which means that they don't get quite the same kind of non-stick surface either. But I also learned on a non-stick or a stainless steel wok, and it works really, really great. So, but if you can't find either of those things, and if you don't live near Chinatown, I've heard a lot of good things about the Joyce Chen wok. They make a really great carbon steel wok. A friend of mine actually has one, and I borrowed it once. I think most of what I was cooking up, most of what I was appreciating is that it was seasoned really well. But if you get yourself a nice carbon steel wok, it will serve you really, really well. So I've had this for over 2 years, and it's been really, really reliable. All right, I'm gonna need to switch over to tongs here. So I'm pulling my meatballs out at this point. They're nice and brown. They are not finished cooking on the interior. So we're at about 130, 120, I think, on the interior of these meatballs. It is okay to pull them out when they're under still because they are going to go back into the wok and finish cooking in that braising liquid. So they don't need to be finished cooking, but we do need them to be mostly cooked. And most importantly is that we need them to be very, very browned and crisped on the exterior. That's really the most important part here, is that we need them to be very, very browned and crisped. The interior, it will finish cooking in the braise, so don't worry. We're going to be braising this for another like 5-10 minutes after we finish cooking them. So we don't need to care too much about making sure that the interior of your meatball is done, as much as we care about making sure that we have a nice browned meatball. Moving on, I'm going to add my next batch of meatballs. We actually only have 3, I just remembered because I measured them wrong. We're going to do the same thing. What we're looking for is a really, really crisp exterior before we start pulling them out. Are your meatballs oily when they're finished, or do you, without any toppings or sides? Not terribly oily. They're definitely fatty because we're using a very, very fatty cut of ground meat. So we're using ground pork, which in my opinion is probably the most fatty kind of ground mince that you can get is ground pork. But that fat is really, really important because it's what allows us to sear. So if we were using a really, really lean cut of meat, that would cause it to burn. So it wouldn't sear, it would just burn, which is not what we're after. So in order to make sure that it sears properly, we have to have quite a bit of fat content. So I do the same thing when I look for steaks too. So when I shop for like New York strip steaks or anything that I'm going to pan sear, I look for steaks with the largest amount of fat in it. So the largest amount of that white cap. And like white fat that's spread throughout. That's also what makes, by random tangent, but that's what makes Wagyu beef so tasty, is because it has so much fat spread throughout the meat. But that fat, it's really, really important to searing. So without that fat, you're not going to be able to sear the meatball. But no, to answer your question, I'm sorry I'm tangenting a little bit. But to answer your question, no, it's not actually that oily because all of the oil is going to stay behind in the wok, and then we're going to wipe that out. And we're going to pour out that oil, so there's a little bit of residual, I think it's a combination of residual cooking oil and a little bit of residual pork fat that has shed into the wok. And what we're actually going to do is remove that oil and then add the meatballs back to the wok with a little bit of oil, so maybe like 2 tablespoons of oil. And then flash cook our bok choy and then just braise with no oil. So it's actually not that oily at all. Right. So I'm letting my meatballs go for another 3 minutes per side. So I'm going to, and when we leave it, we really want to make sure that we don't disturb it for a full 3 minutes. So we're at 2.5 minutes at this point, which is right around the time when I start usually getting a little bit anxious because I'm worried that it's starting to burn. But trust in the process. I promise it's not burning, or maybe it is burning and we have burnt meatballs. But try and trust the process. A little bit over. Yeah, a little bit over. But really, really important when you sear is that you need to leave it undisturbed for a large amount of time. Otherwise, it won't sear. It will just start cooking. And then you'll have like cooked ground meats, but it won't be seared. So we need that really, really crispy edge. And it's also though okay to overcook it a little bit because it's going to go into that braise anyway. All right. Hello to everyone just joining while this is cooking. I can introduce myself one more time. My name is Wesley. This is Woo Can Cook. If this is your first time joining, we're here streaming over on both on Reddit and YouTube every Tuesday and Thursday at 6:30 p.m. PST and Wednesdays on at 6 p.m. PST. Every Friday there's a new recipe video that pops up over on the YouTube channel. So if you haven't popped over to YouTube yet, definitely hop over and check out what's going on over there. This coming Friday, there's a new recipe for a hot and sour soup that's popping up over on YouTube. I'm really excited about that because I've been in a soup funk lately because it's soup weather, so I'm cooking a lot of soup lately. If you're interested in reproducing the things that I cook on these streams, pretty much everything that I cook on stream has a recipe video that goes along with it because essentially what we're doing are cooking our way through all of the recipes that I've been publishing over on YouTube. So if you haven't hopped over to YouTube yet, definitely hop over and check out what's going on over there. That's where all of the recipe videos live. In addition to that, that's also where the concurrent live stream lives, which is the laptop that's going on behind me. On that live stream, there's an entire schedule of everything that I'm going to be cooking over the next, I think, 2.5, almost 3 weeks now in advance. So you can hop over to YouTube and check out what I'm going to be cooking next. I think that says Shizitou. I recognize the Z. My Chinese is really bad. But yeah, over on YouTube there's a concurrent live stream that's also where the whole schedule of everything that I'm going to be cooking lives. So you can hop over and find out what I'm going to be cooking next. Lots of people like to check out what I'm going to be cooking next and then pick something that they want to cook along with me and then pick up some ingredients and cook it with me, which is super, super fun. It's always more fun to cook with other people because then we can talk about all of the mistakes we made. I know I made at least one mistake today, so... always super fun to cook with other people. In addition to the live stream, that's also where all of the recipe videos live. So we have a couple of series that are in progress right now. My favorite series is the Chinese American series. So we've been reproducing a lot of like really, really Americanized Chinese foods like General Tso's chicken and Kung Pao chicken, honey sesame chicken, stuff like that. And taking a look at what makes those things so American. And then removing some of those American qualities. So in those recipes, a lot of times I find myself removing a lot of sugar. And then usually what I'll do is I'll remove some of the sugar or some of those American qualities and replace them with more traditional Chinese ingredients. So oftentimes when I remove sugar, I find myself replacing them with things like spicy chili paste or sweet and sour sauce, stuff like that. Even black vinegar a lot of the times is what I find myself using, stuff like that. And what it results in is this very, very interesting combination of like things that are really just American. So like General Tso's chicken is basically just American fried chicken with a lot of like more traditional Chinese ingredients and flavors that are going on. So that series is really interesting to me because a lot of those foods to me are not really Chinese at all. They're basically just American food. So it's really, really fun. So if you're interested in content like that, I recommend hopping over to YouTube and checking out what's going on over there. Lots of fun stuff popping up. We're working our way to 2,300 subscribers by the end of the month. So if you want to help us hit that goal, hop over and check out what's going on over there. All right. All right, so I'm killing my heat here, and then I'm going to pour off this oil. We don't need all of this oil. Don't pour your used cooking oil. I guess this is something that I should mention. Is don't pour your used cooking oil down the drain. That stuff will coagulate, and it will definitely clog your drain. So be very, very careful. Pour it somewhere else. What I just did was I poured it into a jar. And I have a jar of accumulated used cooking oil, and that I usually dump every couple of months. And it's where I leave all of my residual cooking oil. Whew, my Chinese is real bad. Yeah, General Tso's chicken. Yeah, there's a really interesting documentary that actually inspired that series. It's called The Search for General Tso's. I believe it's still on Netflix, and it basically tracks like where General Tso's chicken comes from. And it comes from a whole bunch of different places. I think it actually originates from the Midwest, or something like that, somewhere very, very American. And essentially what they were doing was that General Tso, by the way, is no one. General Tso is just a random general from the Chinese army, I think in the Ming Dynasty, something like that. And essentially, it's basically just American food, and it's really, really interesting because essentially what Chinese people were doing back then, I think that was back in like the early 1900s, is they were bringing Chinese food over, but making it very, very Americanized. So they were serving it with things like donuts and hamburgers and French fries, and that was to make like people interested in eating those foods because they were like filled with things that were very, very foreign to them. So that like the way that General Tso's chicken has evolved over the last like 2 centuries or like century and a half. It comes from like making food that Americans want to eat, which is really, really interesting. And that is also explained. So if you live in a metropolitan area, you have probably seen at some point there's a Chinese. You'll probably have in your neighborhood a Chinese restaurant that is both a Chinese restaurant and also serves hamburgers and donuts, usually coffee too. Plus with like General Tso's chicken on the side, and I've discovered from that series that that's where that comes from. It comes from that's how Chinese people were getting Americans to eat Chinese foods, by combining it with donuts and coffee and hamburgers and stuff. Super, super interesting. All right, so I'm rinsing my wok off. This is super important to batch cooking, is that we want to rinse the wok down, otherwise we'll be adding burnt food to our wok, which you don't want. And then I'm restarting the fire, and we're going to reheat our wok and start all over again. So we're reheating the wok. That will take maybe 30 seconds. We do want to make sure that you rinse the wok down before you move on. Otherwise, what is left behind in that wok? There are 2 things that are left behind in that wok, one of which is kind of a bummer. The one main thing that's left behind in the wok is fat. So it's like fat and things that come off when you have a Maillard reaction, so burnt charred bits. In a lot of European cooking, we call that fond, which is like really, really tasty bits. So like bacon fat, charred bits of ground mince, stuff like that. And that's where a lot of flavor lives. The other thing that's left behind is charred, burnt stuff. The burnt part is stuff that we don't want to add to your stir fry, because if you add burnt things to your stir fry, you're going to have little bits of like flaked burnt parts, or like flaked or burnt garlic, stuff like that floating around in your stir fry. So we absolutely do need to rinse it off. It is a bummer because what you're rinsing off is a lot of fond, which is a lot of flavor. But it is a really, really essential part to batch cooking, because if you don't rinse that off, you're going to have a lot of burnt crap floating around in your stir fry, which I have done before. It's not fun. All right. I'm going to let this go for a little bit longer. I'm watching my wok. We have a little bit of smoke. I don't see quite enough smoke going on yet, so I'm going to let that go for a little bit longer. We're paying attention to make sure that our wok is hot enough to stir fry. So right now I don't see quite enough heat coming off, so I don't think it's ready to stir fry. So I'm going to let it sit on heat for a little bit longer, maybe another like 30, 45 seconds. And you'll notice that as I sit here, there's more and more smoke coming off of that wok. That's a sign that we have more and more heat building up. And next up, what we're going to do, now that we have our finished meatball, by the way, we can pop over and take a look at our finished meatballs. We have these nice crispy seared meatballs. They're probably like 80 to 85% cooked through on the inside. And we're going to flash cook our veggies first. So we're going to do our garlic, ginger, and bok choy. And then we're going to add these meatballs back to the wok. And we're going to braise it for a little bit longer. So it will probably braise a little bit, maybe another like 5 to 7 minutes in that braising sauce. And that's going to get us that really, really tender, but also like very, very sauce heavy meatball. And that's where that comes from. Does a standard gas stove have enough BTUs to impart wok hei? Yes and no. I personally don't think that wok hei is so I'll start off by explaining wok hei. So wok hei comes from Chinese cooking, and what is essentially is the flavor of the wok. So I think it's called the breath of the wok, something like that. And essentially what it is the smokiness that you get from wok cooking. And what that really comes from is the extremely high BTUs that come from restaurant wok cooking. So very, very often when you're trying to reproduce that, you will find that you don't have enough heat to get that really, really smoky flavor. I think that's actually not true. I think that if you approach batch cooking properly, you will definitely get some wok hei. But not the same as you would on a restaurant burner, which is why if you want true wok cooking, you have to go out and buy yourself either a commercial kitchen burner or a wok burner, which is powered by propane. So it's basically a barbecue without the barbecue.
It's basically just propane lit on fire, and it's just kind of like a giant jet engine that's spitting out propane fire that you can cook really, really hot on. If you don't go out and get that, I have seen one really, really cool hack that I learned from Kenji Lopez, actually. And what he does is he has a blowtorch and then just hits the stir fry at the very, very end with a blowtorch, and then kind of like sears it with a little bit of smokiness with that blowtorch, which is really, really interesting. I actually don't own a blowtorch. That's on my like to-do list, or like random gear that I need to acquire is a blowtorch. And apparently, allegedly, according to Kenji, is that you can get the similar flavor of wok hei from that blowtorch, and that's where that flavor or like the breath of the wok comes from. Good question though, yeah. Personally though, I think that you can get a similar smokiness and effect from a wok without that high BTUs. But I have been like itching to get my hands on a blowtorch and try and do that, because that seems really, really interesting. I know everything about Lion's Head Meatballs. Yeah, I kind of know some stuff about Lion's Head Meatballs. How's it going, Crystal, by the way? All right, so over on the stove, our wok is smoking nice and hot, which means that we're ready to start cooking again. All right, we're flash cooking our veggies, which has quite a bit of volume, which means that we need quite a bit of oil here. So this is maybe 4 to 6 tablespoons, about a quarter cup of oil here. And we're doing our long yao one more time, so we're giving it a swirl, coating our wok in that oil, and then we're ready to start cooking. So the first thing that we're adding is our aromatics. So this is our garlic, or ginger, excuse me, followed by our garlic. And we're gonna let that go just long enough until it becomes fragrant. So use your nose and smell. When you start smelling garlic and ginger, you have bloomed your aromatics. That usually is about 10 to 15 seconds for me. But use your nose, pay attention. What does it smell like when you start smelling? It means you're ready to go. All right, I'm following that up with our bok choy. And we're giving that a quick toss. We don't need our bok choy to be fully cooked through and like tenderized. We're really looking for a pretty crispy bok choy here. So we're not trying to fully cook this through. What we're really looking for is just like a flash cooked veggie, which is the quality of veggies that you're probably most familiar with in wok cooking and like Chinese stir fries. It's like pretty crispy. It's not raw because it's cooked on extremely high heat, but it's still also pretty crispy. Because, or like you might even say like an undercooked vegetable. But that extremely high heat for a very, very short duration of time is going to give us that like crispy but cooked vegetable. That's super, super important to wok fried veggies. All right, I'm gonna let that go for, that will maybe take another 45 seconds. Once we have a little bit of cook through, we can add our meatballs and start braising. Yeah, thanks, Crystal. Yeah, always enjoy seeing you pop in those streams. Ooh, yeah, concave bottom induction burner. I have never tried one. I have seen them, and I have seen people cook on those things, and it seems to work really, really well. I don't know anything about those though. I've definitely seen a lot of wok cooking happen on those things, and it seems like it works really, really well if you pair it with a round bottom wok. For everyone else watching, essentially what those are is it's an induction top, but it curves inward, so it's basically a bowl, and you put a round bottom wok inside of it, and apparently, allegedly, it creates enough heat to really, really get that wok extremely hot. I've never used one though. I'm very, very curious. All right, so I'm adding my meatballs back to our wok, followed by our braising sauce. And we're gonna let our meatballs braise for maybe 5 minutes, maybe a little bit less than that. We're looking for a couple of things here. The first thing that we're looking for is the interior of a meatball to finish cooking. So I usually like to just eyeball it from this point because I've cooked this dish so many times. But if you're not familiar, what we're looking for is about 160 degrees Fahrenheit on the inside. So break out your meat thermometers if you're not certain, and check the temperature. We're looking for 160 inside. I have gotten pretty good at eyeballing these things, although maybe I'll check the temperature. Am I going to share delicious food with anybody? Yeah, actually. So my brother and his wife just had a baby. So I've been setting aside all of the leftovers for my brother Steve. Apparently, when you have a baby, there's not enough time to cook dinner, which kind of adds up. So he usually gets all the leftovers. He also asked me to freeze it though, so I don't know why. He doesn't trust that it will stay for, because I only deliver it like every week every once a week, and he doesn't think that it will stay in the refrigerator. All right, so I'm adding my cornstarch to the wok here, and this is going to create a nice thick braising sauce. So that's going to very rapidly start thickening up our braising sauce. So you'll notice that our sauce just went very, very quickly from a pretty loose, liquidy sauce to a very, very thick and luxurious sauce. I'm looking for a little bit more cook time here, and this is cooking down a little bit faster than I like. So I'm adding just a little bit of water. I'd say that was like a little bit less than a quarter cup of water. And that's going to give us a little bit more time in the braise before the liquid starts coming down. All right. So you'll notice that as soon as I added that cornstarch, our braising sauce became a very, very thick and luxurious sauce. That's super, super important. So in my opinion, cornstarch is probably the most important part of all wok cooking because it's how you develop a thick sauce. Without that cornstarch, all sautés would just end up pretty loose and pretty watery. Without that cornstarch, it's a very, very important ingredient. I feel like it's the one thing that a lot of people don't realize is in most Chinese cooking. Pretty much all wok stir fries is cornstarch. All right, so I'm removing everything from my wok. This is the last thing that we want to do. I've started saying this at the end of pretty much every stream now. But the very last thing that we want to do before we move on and start eating this stuff is clean your wok. It's super, super important to clean your wok while it's still hot. Because while the wok is hot, it's still very, very non-stick. So I don't have a camera over the sink. But what I did was I just rinsed the wok down. And everything just came right off. I didn't scrub anything. Everything just came right off with a little bit of water. Almost everything. What remains is probably just a little bit of stuff that we can scrub off. No, it even came off. That's super, super important because while you have that non-stick surface, you can do that. So you can rinse it down with water and everything will come right off. If you wait and like sit down and eat our food first and then come back to the wok with all of that stuff in it, like 30 to 45 minutes later, what will happen is that wok will have cooled down and all of that residual sauce will now be stuck to the wok. And then you have this situation where you have to start scrubbing that stuff off, which is not where you want to be. Anytime that you're cooking in a carbon steel wok, you don't want to be scrubbing. This is actually also true with cast iron too, is that you don't want to be in a position where you have to start scrubbing, because once you start scrubbing, what you're scrubbing off is not just the food that's stuck to it, but you're also scrubbing off seasoning, and that seasoning is what's making your woks non-stick. So as soon as you start scrubbing that seasoning off, it's not going to be non-stick anymore. So that doesn't mean that you can't scrub these materials. So I have definitely used a sponge on my wok before. But it's just generally not a situation where you want to be. You want to try and avoid scrubbing that stuff as much as you possibly can. Otherwise, you're going to eventually start scrubbing your seasoning off. So you'll notice, can you see this? Maybe if I turn it around. Yeah, I think you can see it. So this spot right here, that's a spot where the seasoning started to flake on my wok. So what had happened was I think I did a pad CU a couple of weeks ago, maybe a week or two ago, and I accidentally burnt the eggs. So the eggs got stuck to the wok, and then a very small portion of the seasoning of my wok got scrubbed off when I started scrubbing the eggs off, which is not a good thing. It's okay, it will eventually come back. I have definitely scrubbed the seasoning off of my wok on accident many times. So it's not the end of the world, but we want to try and avoid doing that as much as you can so that you don't scrub your seasoning off. And the last thing that I'm doing is I'm just coating the wok in a little bit of oil. And this is just to make sure that nothing starts rusting. And now it's good to use again. So the next time that you're ready to cook on your wok, you'll have this nice, clean, non-stick, seasoned wok ready to go. So super important, save yourself some aggravation and clean that stuff off before you start eating. I know it's super frustrating because you're ready to eat already and you just want to eat food because there's food in front of you, but I guarantee you you're going to save yourself a really big headache if you clean that stuff while the wok is hot. All right, so if you're cooking for many people, this is one of my favorite dishes to cook for, like family style meals where you're sharing with lots of people, because there's 8 very large meatballs that you can chop up for everyone. So when I was a kid, what we used to do is chop these things into like quarters and then sort of serve it. And then because I was the younger child, usually I didn't get the last meatball. And lots of times what we would do is just eat the braising sauce with some rice, and it's actually really tasty on its own. So that's it. That's my approach to Shanghainese lion's head meatballs. If you've been streaming or watching the stream the entire time, you'll notice that there were a handful of things that don't really fall under the category of a traditional lion's head meatball. Definitely the use of panko breadcrumb is not a traditional element. The more traditional thing to use would be a cornstarch, which would also make it gluten-free. So if you're trying to keep it gluten-free, definitely use cornstarch. I know my dad loves the approach of using cornstarch because he's from Shanghai. And thinks that that's the only way to make lion's head meatball. I actually disagree though. I think that the use of panko breadcrumb gives you a more crispy exterior with a really tender interior. Whereas the use of cornstarch, it kind of doesn't develop as much of a crispy exterior, which, now that I think about it, is maybe one of the qualities of like the lion's head meatballs that I used to eat when I was a kid. But I like them to be a little bit more crispy. So, oh yeah, take a bite. Yeah, I always forget to take a bite. So you'll notice, I guess it's important to split the meatball open, that the interior of the meatball, it's nice and cooked through, so it is definitely cooked through, so I did eyeball it correctly. But it is also very tender, so while the exterior is very crispy, the interior is super tender. Yeah, that's really good. So it's very tender inside, but it has this really nice crispy exterior from the sear that we did. And it has this really interesting, like, surprising bit of chew that comes from that water chestnut, which is why I think that water chestnut is really important to the Shanghainese lion's head meatball. Also, the braising sauce is filled with a lot of flavor, so you can, when you run out of meatball, which you will inevitably run out of meatballs before you run out of braising sauce, you can absolutely eat that braising sauce with a little bit of rice. And that's definitely what I used to do when I was a kid, because usually the last meatball went to my brother. So, you're late to the stream. It looks, yeah, bok choy. Yeah, so it's baby bok choy actually. So baby bok choy, it looks pretty similar to bok choy. It's basically bok choy, but it's picked a little bit earlier, and it's a little bit more tender than full-grown bok choy. So if you've ever had large bits of bok choy that are a little bit chewy and like not quite, almost feels, kind of tastes like it's not cooked through. So that's like actually one of like my earliest memories of bok choy, is it being very chewy, and kind of, it was the vegetable that I used to have to like wash down with a large amount of water. And that's because it can be really, really chewy when it's full grown. So I love using baby bok choy instead because it's a little bit more tender. And it also like works really, really well in a long braise. So in almost all of the recipes that I do that involve a braise, I use bok choy because it's really, really great for a long braise. Yeah, totally. Cool. So I think that's it. I think I've done everything. I think I'm ready to eat. So if you have any questions for me, feel free to drop your questions in the chat. I don't know everything about Lion's Head Meatballs, but I know lots of stuff. Crystal thinks that I know everything. I actually don't know everything. I just know lots of stuff. And I picked my dad's brain quite a bit about these meatballs. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat. If I missed anything, feel free to repeat your questions too. I know I missed stuff when I'm facing the stove a lot. So if I missed anything, feel free to repeat yourself. And I will definitely do my best to circle back and answer everyone. If you haven't yet, definitely hop over to YouTube and check out what's going on over there. I know lots of folks have already popped over and checked that out already. That's also where the concurrent live stream lives, so if you're paying attention, there's another laptop that exists behind me. That laptop is where the YouTube stream lives. So on that YouTube stream, there's a whole series or schedule of everything that I'm going to be cooking for the next, I think, almost 3 weeks in advance. So if you were paying attention or watching over on YouTube, you would have known a couple weeks ago that I would be doing this dish. So lots of folks have started tuning in and checking out the things that they're interested in cooking, and then cooking some stuff with me, which is always more fun. Because then we can talk about all the things that we messed up. So it's super relieves some anxiety. I know I messed up at least one thing today. I don't know if anyone noticed, but I burned 2 meatballs. When we're cooking together, we can talk about those things. So when we're not cooking together and we're cooking by ourselves, then we have to like just wallow in our mistakes. So in addition to the live stream, that's also where all of the recipe videos live. So if you're trying to reproduce what I'm cooking today, pretty much everything that I cook on stream, it has a recipe video that goes along with it. In those recipe videos, they move a little bit slower and kind of take a little bit more time to talk through some of the decision making that goes behind the things that I do in recipes, and like why I add certain things, why I leave some things out. So in this particular instance, I was being very cautious with how much dark soy sauce and oyster sauce I used. And that was because I was paying attention to like how thick and how dark the sauce was getting. Those things like that, we talk a little bit more about those things in those recipe videos, so they're really interesting to dive into if you're following from the live streams. There's a couple of series that are going on right now. This particular dish is part of a larger series that we've been doing, dissecting food from the San Francisco Bay Area restaurant scene. So this particular dish comes from a restaurant in San Francisco called Dragon House. We've done a couple of things from another Thai restaurant called Nicha Thai here in Oakland. And I forget what other restaurant. Oh, we've done some dim sum stuff. We just did a dim sum cake from the dim sum spot here in Oakland called Ming's Tasty. That was for the Malai Gao, Malaysian brown sugar cake. This Friday coming up, we have a hot and sour soup coming up from a restaurant in Oakland called Shandong. That's going to be really, really tasty. Lots of fun stuff like that popping up over there. There's a whole series that's dedicated to just reproducing foods from TV and film. So I released another recipe over on Gift Recipe this morning for a cocktail bun that uses a dough for a hack that I did for a Legend of Korra recipe that was really fun. Stuff like that all lives over on YouTube. So if you're interested in things like that, definitely hop over to the YouTube channel and check that out. If you're watching on YouTube, you're already there. Well done. If you're watching on Reddit, that would be the YouTube channel at the bottom of the screen. So lots of fun stuff popping up over there. We're working our way to 2,300 subscribers by the end of the month. So if you want to help us hit that goal, hop over to YouTube and check some stuff out over there. Lots of fun stuff coming up. Cool. Oh yeah, and the last thing that I'll mention is lots of people ask me about the music. So I write all of the beats that are playing behind my voiceovers. So and they're also all of the beats that are in all of the recipe videos too. So if you're looking for the music that's under the Spotify and YouTube account now, it's called Woo Cooks Beats. So it's the sister account to this cooking channel. Laksa. What's the laksa? Leo. Yeah, sorry, I don't know what that is. But if you explain it, or maybe I'll Google it and I'll look it up if I can figure it out. That sounds very interesting. It is. Oh yeah. Ooh yeah, that looks really good. Indonesian food. So laksa, Indonesian food is something that I've been trying to get into. It uses a whole different set of spices that I'm not familiar with. So both actually Indonesian food and Indian food use a whole set of spices that I'm not familiar with. So I have to acclimate myself to those things and like kind of figure out what makes those things tick before I really dive into them. But as soon as I kind of figure out how those cuisines work, I will definitely take a shot at that. So that sounds really, really tasty. But I'll add it to the list though. That's really interesting, and I will check it out for sure. Cool. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll be back tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. PST doing General Tso's chicken. I know someone asked, or at least 2 people asked about the General Tso's chicken yesterday, and I mistakenly told them that it was happening today. It's actually happening tomorrow, so if you're looking for the General Tso's chicken stream, that's happening tomorrow at 6:30 p.m. PST. So tune in again. I'll see you tomorrow. All right, thanks, everyone. Bye.
meatballs.